morning and afternoon to all of you. Bonjour à tous. As we begin, please note that we are using simultaneous translation for today's workshop. To select French audio, use the Globe Live translation icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. Joelle, to you in French.
Bonjour à tous, bienvenue à ce webinaire de l'Association canadienne des parcs et loisirs. Ce webinaire est en anglais, mais nous avons l'interprétation en français. Le bouton se trouve dans le bas de votre page Zoom à droite. C'est marqué interprétation, c'est un petit globe. Vous devez cliquer dessus et puis sélectionner français. Vous avez aussi reçu la présentation par courriel et puis vous allez la voir dans discussion aussi, la présentation en français.
My name is Krista Costas Bradstreet. I am the Director of Partnerships and Policy for the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association, or CPRA. My pronouns are she and her. Joining me to introduce the workshop and CPRA in French is Joelle Deroule, who you've just met, our Quebec Francophone liaison. As the national office of CPRA is located in Ottawa, I would like to acknowledge that CPRA is located on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Mohawk First Nations. We acknowledge the historical oppression of lands, cultures, and of the original peoples in what we now know as Canada, and we aim to contribute to the healing and decolonizing journey we all share together. For those of us who are settlers, through our work at CPRA, we commit to recognizing and honoring the relationships between Indigenous people, their ways of life, and their land. So today's workshop is the second of 5 ReImagine RREC workshops. But before I introduce our presenters for today's workshop, I would like to just acknowledge my colleague, MJ Akonde, CPRA's Director of Operations. Without MJ, these workshops would definitely not be possible. So many thanks to MJ in the background. And then to begin our workshop today, Joelle and I would like to take a few minutes to introduce you to CPRA.
Merci,
sorry, one slide back, MJ. Thank you.
Merci MJ. MJ est à l'arrière, c'est elle qui fait tout le travail d'organisation. Merci beaucoup. Donc, la vision de la CPL. La CPL est une coalition de toutes les associations provinciales et territoriales de parcs et de loisirs au Canada. Collectivement, nous rêvons d'un Canada où chacun peut vivre des expériences récréatives, enrichissantes et accessibles qui permettent aux individus et aux collectivités de s'épanouir tout en protégeant notre environnement naturel et bâti.
Thanks. Canadian Parks and Recreation Association is a national organization dedicated to realizing the full potential of parks and recreation as a major contributor to community health and vibrancy. That's the next slide, MJ. Over its 60-year history, CPRA has been the national voice for parks and recreation, advancing the collective interests of our members through leadership and advocacy, policy, and research. CPRA is a national network dedicated to the well-being of people, communities, and the natural and built environments. And it serves as a resource for our members and partners by contributing knowledge and opportunities that enhance and grow the sector. Joelle, next slide.
La force collective de la CPL, c'est son réseau. Il est constitué de 13 associations provinciales et territoriales qui partagent leur expérience et leur savoir-faire. Les membres du conseil d'administration, l'effectif provincial et territorial, les bénévoles, les partenaires gouvernementaux et les secteurs alliés participent à la réalisation des objectifs en s'appuyant sur un bureau national composé de 8 employés qui assurent la permanence.
Thanks. And next slide. CPRA is engaged in actually several initiatives and too many to chat about today, but I did want to mention the bench, as we always do in our webinars. We introduced it in the summer of 2020. And it is CPRA's online community, which is a place for the sector to meet, to work, and to grow together. It features a number of things such as the COVID-19 and other resources, events, discussion groups, a portal dedicated to the framework for recreation in Canada, and for Parks for All, and professional development, as well as a job board. And excitedly, coming early in 2022, we will relaunch an updated benefits hub. So we'd really like to encourage you to sign up to the bench, share the link with colleagues to help quickly grow this new online community and actively participate in the different opportunities. So next slide. As I mentioned, we are using simultaneous translation today, and there will be information in the chat box if there isn't already about how to use it. And we have also enabled the transcription function. So Joelle will just repeat in French.
Donc, comme mentionné un peu plus tôt, le webinaire aujourd'hui, comme vous l'entendez, est en anglais avec un interprète en français. Donc, pour pouvoir écouter l'interprète, vous devez cliquer sur l'icône interprète dans le bas à droite de votre fenêtre Zoom et puis choisir français. Aussi, pour vous aider à suivre, vous devriez avoir reçu la présentation en français par courriel. Vous pouvez aussi la trouver dans le chat. Il y aura 5 groupes de discussion en français. Ces groupes ne seront pas enregistrés, mais le reste du webinaire, oui. Donc, vous pourrez retrouver l'enregistrement sur le banc auquel nous vous invitons à vous joindre. L'adresse courriel, c'est lebanc@cpl.ca. Christa, à toi.
So for today's workshop, we will have one breakout group. It will be a small group, and we invite you to discuss and share only as much as you would like and are comfortable in doing. The breakout groups will not be recorded. At the end of the workshop, you will have an opportunity to complete a survey, and we would really appreciate your feedback. We will also email it to you after the workshop. We will find you. And then also within a day or two, you will be able to access the recording of the workshop that can be found on the bench. We've started a discussion group as well on the bench to address many of the topics that we'll be focusing on. And again, would love it if you could join us on the bench to contribute to that. So just before we get started, I'd like to invite Mike Roma and Michelle Healey to join us. Mike Roma is the chair of the Cpra Board of Directors, and he will just start us off with a few words. Thanks, Mike.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Krista. Hello, bonjour. And on behalf of the Cpra board, welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm just having trouble getting my camera up, so you're just going to have to hear my voice. At Cpra, we're very proud of the ReImagine RREC work that I guess our team has completed and the leadership that it demonstrates in the recreation and parks sector in Canada. Inclusion, diversity, and equity has always been important to our sector, and it's always been relevant. And I think the pandemic has probably accentuated that for sure. But like I said, it's always been at the forefront. As an organization, Cpra is focused on, I'd say, an internal journey related to the subject matter. We do a lot of work at our board table, sharing education and so on. And we're also eager and proud of providing leadership in the sector regarding the subject matter too. We're also proud of a partnership that we have with the FPT Physical Activity and Recreation Committee in presenting some of these ReImagine RREC workshops. And I'd like to introduce and thank Michelle Healey, who's the Director of Recreation and Director of the Recreation and Sport Division with the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador. She's also on the FPT Physical Activity and Recreation Committee, and she co-chairs the Framework for Recreation in Canada leadership team. So, Michelle, I'll hand it over to you, and thanks everybody.
Super, thanks, Mike. You make me sound really official and really important by all those roles, but I'm happy to be with you all today. And certainly Park supports this important workshop on inclusion, diversity, equity, and access in community sport, recreation, physical activity. And as Mike alluded to earlier, you know, the value of community sport, recreation, physical activity to Canadians, and certainly at the community level, has become clear throughout the pandemic. But I will also say the pandemic has disproportionately impacted disadvantaged groups. So shining a light on those issues of diversity, equity, inclusion. So from my perspective and Park's perspective, it is vital that all players, including governments, other stakeholders, share research and learnings and discuss implications and path forward for health and social equity in community sport, recreation, and physical activity. And I'd certainly like to express my thanks to the Cpra for hosting today's workshop, and I wish you all a productive and successful session.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Mike, for your words to get us started today. So I'd now like to turn it over to John Frittenberg. John is the president of the JF Group, which for the past 35 years has advised clients in the recreation and sport sectors. He provides strategic, management, and practical advice to public, private, and not-for-profit clients throughout Canada. He works at the local, provincial, and national levels of the recreation and sport sectors on projects ranging from feasibility and business analysis for single facilities to large multi-sport ventures like the work he did for the upcoming Pan Am Games. So John, I'll turn it over to you right now. And next slide, MJ.
Thank you, Krista, and welcome everybody. On behalf of the ReImagine RREC leadership team, I'd like to welcome everybody to this workshop. This is actually the second of two workshops. We held the first back in October about safe reopening of facilities. We also had one back in June that talked about the ReImagine RREC project, which was basically a summary of phase one results. So the ReImagine RREC project did a lot of uncovering findings, many of which are going to be touched on today. So I'm very excited about today's workshop because it does encapsulate many of the findings that, or does deal with many of the findings that ReImagine RREC uncovered. Next slide, please. ReImagine RREC is a multifaceted recovery initiative that had four key components to it, each of which had its own learnings emerging. The first is a literature review. This was an international review of academic papers and other studies. We deliberately made it an international review simply because many countries were already ahead of us in terms of their exposure to COVID-related impacts, and we knew we could learn from their experiences. We did a survey analysis. We did not do a survey, but rather captured data from existing surveys that there was a multitude of. We actually analyzed approximately 130 different survey templates. So we also did some key informant interviews and focus groups, one of which focused specifically on today's topics. So some of the topics that came out of that focus group will be addressed today. And lastly, we did best practices and next practices, and we have over 70 of those that are presented. We developed four independent reports, all of which are located on the bench, and one summary report. And I'd strongly encourage all of you to get onto the bench, look for the ReImagine RREC button and download those reports or the infographics that accompany them, because in many cases, the information presented in those infographics, it's basically a summary and it's very attractively presented, can be used by you in your various presentations to your senior decision makers. So, like I say, the bench is a very useful place to go to get this information. Also, you should know that all of the information will be presented in our 5-part workshop series that this is the second of. Next slide, please. It's important for you to know that what we're presenting in our workshops, all of them, in fact, including today's, are information upon which you can base your own plans and create your own implementation strategies. We know that the COVID is impacting markets across the country differently. So to come up with a recommendation that would apply across all realms would be extremely difficult. So we're presenting information and fact that you can use in your decision-making process, but we strongly advise you to be constantly aware of public health information because everything really should be based on the science. Next slide, please. We've learned a lot about COVID since we started this project, and a lot of the information has been quite revealing. In fact, we know a lot more now than we did just a few months ago. We know now that it looks very likely that we'll be living with COVID or other related viruses for the foreseeable future. We know that we know much more about how these viruses are transmitted, and hence many of the responses can be more targeted than they were at the beginning. You remember back in March or April of 2020, people were scrambling to try to figure out what to do. We know now much more about how it's transmitted, and consequently, as I said, we can be more targeted. We also know that vaccines are, without question, the #1 defense against the virus. We also know that air handling and air transmission and filtration and introduction of fresh air into buildings and spaces is very, very important to mitigate the impact of the virus. We also know that the situations across the country, across Canada, are different. We have different vaccination rates, different infection rates, and so on. So consequently, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of situation. We also know, and some of you may have been affected by this, that the measures that seem reasonable to some people are not to others. And consequently, there is pushback against either more restrictive measures, such as the vaccine passports that are being introduced in various jurisdictions. So those consequences are unfortunate, and some of you may well have been exposed to unfortunate situations as a result of it. But in any case, that's the nature of the beast at the moment. We also now know, we know now that the virus does not respect sectoral boundaries. In other words, if you're operating an arena or a fitness center or meeting rooms or a community center, whether it's in the private sector, public sector, or not-for-profit sector, the virus will take hold and cause havoc regardless of the sector. But what we do know, and it's been interesting to watch this unravel, is that the decision-making process in each one of those sectors may be different. So consequently, it may be a little easier to rapidly implement a particular measure in one environment rather than another. But that doesn't mean that any sector is immune to the negative impact of the virus. So what we're doing through ReImagine REC is to provide tools that help you to develop your own responses that fit your own local circumstance, your sectoral needs, your decision-making process, and so on. Next slide, please. So as we've moved through this, we have known that there, as was mentioned a little bit earlier, there were problems or cracks in the system prior to COVID. But what the virus has done is it's illustrated the significance of those cracks. And we know that the pandemic has actually impacted different groups of people or different individuals differently based upon a whole series of circumstances. That's why I'm very excited about today's topic, because it addresses exactly that. We also know that women and girls were disproportionately impacted for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was their greater challenges they have with domestic responsibility and childcare, just to name one. They also had issues with low wages and the type of work that a lot of women are actually engaged in. And that kept them away from participation in sport, but also we're finding it interesting that it's kept them away from participation on boards and other groups associated with community sport organizations. So as a result, it's not just their own personal impact, but it's also with the organizations that they're working with. We knew we had a labor shortage in the sector before COVID. It now exacerbated that labor shortage. and many of you may well be encountering that. My own opinion is it's going to get worse before it gets better. Because, for example, we haven't trained too many lifeguards or people in the aquatic stream for quite some time because of various shutdowns and restrictions. So part of the workshop that we're delivering on December the 2nd will deal with HR issues and try to provide some concepts and some supports that might help you in developing your own strategies. As was mentioned a little bit earlier, the general public has developed a brand new appreciation for the services that we provide. We in the sector always knew that we were providing something that was a contributor to the health and well-being of society, but now it's a more broadly accepted concept. We also know that senior decision makers are recognizing this fact and in fact and are more responsive to requests in some jurisdictions at least for help and support in furthering that notion. Technology has boomed. It really has offered new levels of service that are available to us. Here we are meeting virtually. We've got 200 people on the line. That's just a demonstration of how technology has moved forward. From a program delivery perspective, we know that technology is leaking into the program delivery realm, and in fact, in many cases, people are producing 3 kinds of delivery: in-person indoors, in-person outdoors, and in-person and virtual, or just virtual. I heard one presentation a couple of days ago where the person was saying, if you're in the fitness business and if you don't have a hybrid service delivery approach, including in-person and virtual, you really don't have a very good plan. So I can see virtual, or at least technology being used for program delivery purposes in the long term. As another example, over 100 or close to 100,000 fitness apps have been developed in the last 24 months. That just goes to show you the acceptance of that. So subscriptions to connected services have also gone through the roof. So we know that technology and the use of technology for program delivery is likely here to stay. We also know that technology is assisted in helping people train and learn remotely. I can see this being something that will be applied not just to our sector, but right across the entire realm. And also, it's not just in training or in program delivery, but technology is also being used to facilitate other issues, or to mitigate other issues, such as automation that would open doors and cause there to be limited high touch areas, or automatic sprays in locker rooms and changing rooms for disinfectant purposes. And public preferences have also changed. We know that people are going to come, when they do come back, assuming they do come back, their preferences will be different than they were before. We know that 80% of Canadians have expressed a high degree of appreciation for parks and outdoor spaces. I would expect to see program delivery migration to the outdoors. Recent data, 40 to 80% of former fitness members have come back to their gyms. On the high side of that, in other words, the 80%, that's linked to a better and more strategic communication plan that the facility had implemented. On the low end, they were less successful in communicating with people throughout the pandemic. And we also know that there's more preference self-directed rather than supervised activities. And lastly, the sector has always been very adaptable. And when at the front end of the pandemic, when community centers in the municipal sector were being used for food distribution sites, testing sites, eventually vaccination sites, we heard from other sectors how adaptable and how good staff within our sector were in terms of adapting to that new norm. I don't see that, we don't see that changing in the near future. We see us having to be nimble and having to adapt to new circumstances. So and I think our sector is well positioned and our staff are well trained in order to be able to be successful there. So with that, I'll close off and I'll turn it back to Krista, who will introduce our two feature presenters today. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thanks for setting the stage and for all your good work with your colleagues. Joe, who's on the call today, I'm not sure if the others are, but for your good work around the ReImagine RREC program. So yes, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Andrea Carey is a Canadian certified inclusion professional. She holds a Master's of Education in Leadership Studies and is a champion of inclusion. Andrea recently completed a graduate certificate in executive coaching, is Dare to Lead trained, and Nova Profile certified. As the founder and chief inclusion officer with Inclusion Incorporated, Andrea supports clients to create cultures of belonging and inclusion and has worked extensively on inclusion and improved access for Indigenous peoples, newcomers, persons with disabilities, and women and girls. Andrea has worked as a special advisor on disability inclusion for Minister Carla Qualtrough and brings extensive experience in business operations, facility management, human resources, strategic planning, marketing, group facilitation, curriculum development, and in-product development. Andrea volunteered with the Canadian Paralympic Committee as a board director and chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. And she currently sits on the board of Kidsport Victoria and co-chairs the National Parasport Collective. Nasreen Ali is manager of inclusion projects. She is a self-described facilitation geek, a policy nerd, and social innovator. After completing a master's in public administration and Bachelor of Political Science, she has been advancing public policy for equity-seeking groups across Canada ever since. Spanning national, provincial, and municipal organizations, Nasreen has made her mark on the areas of public policy that affect housing and homelessness, LGBTQI2S+ youth housing, newcomers, women and gender diverse people, and domestic violence, childcare, and economic policy. She believes lived experience is the greatest asset to any work related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And it's her hope that by disrupting what we thought was possible about belonging, we will create a world that is just, fair, and equitable. So I'm so pleased to introduce both Andrea and Nasreen and turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Krista, and great to be here with everyone and looking forward to taking you through this journey and so this next conversation. So we will begin in just a second. I'm just not, MJ, if you can unshare for 1 second the remote control, I need to unmute myself. Oh, that's great. MJ? Super, thank you. And if you can give me controls, that would be awesome. Super, thanks so much. Sorry for the tech glitch, folks. It's lots of pieces in play, as many of you can appreciate living on Zoom these days. So I want to begin by acknowledging the territories that we're on today, which are those of the Coast Salish peoples. I'm here in Victoria and have been grateful to be an uninvited settler on these territories of the Wasanich, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples over the last 25 years, and grew up as an uninvited settler on Ktunaxa territory in the East Kootenays. And I continue to seek to learn and unlearn about the territories and the histories of Indigenous peoples across this country. And I think we've got many beautiful lessons we can learn from the cultures that exist across this country that we have not had the opportunity to learn about, and we haven't taken the time. So this is our opportunity right now to do so. So I won't give you the Zoom setup because I'm sure you're all pretty familiar, but if you've got any questions or comments throughout, please send us a note in the chat. You can either send Nasreen or I something directly in the chat, or you can publicly acknowledge it. We'll have time for questions as we go through. And we do want to begin with some introductions, so we'll get there in just a second. Krista did a lovely introduction, lengthy of each of us, but to give you a couple of additional pieces, I identify with the pronouns she, her, hers, and L. And I also am a cisgender female, so I identify as the gender that I was born as. I'm married and I have a 9-year-old child. I identify as being non-disabled, neurotypical, and I'm a brain tumor survivor and have some ongoing impacts from that. I come from Irish and Welsh ancestry. And you've heard a lot about my educational background, so I won't continue on that. Nasreen, over to you, inviting you into the space to join us today for this conversation. Nasreen? Okay, well, I will complete Nasreen's introduction, and she'll join us in a second. Nasreen also identifies with the pronouns she, her, hers, and elle, and also cisgender female, identifies as able-bodied and neuroatypical, and comes from a Moroccan and Berber background.
Hi, I'm back. Sorry about that. I also like to make an entrance. Thank you so much for your patience. Zoom kind of glitched out of me. I thought I'd restart. So thank you so much for having me join you today. And I'm really excited to talk about this. And as folks were doing their introductions, I recalled a project that I did with the city of Kingston and my master's degree around protecting a local park that was actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And just remembered how important that piece of land was to that community and how much depth our recreation and parks in our communities have to our cultures, our connection with each other. Anyhow, I'll look forward to continue to talk to you all throughout the workshop, and please feel free to message us questions as we go through. Thank you, Andrea.
Super, thanks, Nasreen. Okay, so we want to invite you in to do some virtual handshakes so that we can get to know a little bit of who's on the call. And we have about 100 people on the call, I believe. So certainly aren't able to invite you in to speak, but we would love to hear from you in the chat box. And you can tell us your name, if you know the territories that you're calling in from, or else the community you're calling in from. And we would invite you to choose your favorite handshake. So we've got a high five, we have a pound it, we have a switcheroo, and my personal favorite, the happy salmon, which is like a salmon tail slapping on the other person's arm. So in our virtual world, inviting you to share those in the chat box and introduce yourself so that we get a bit of a sense of who's in the room as well. So, and if you want to pop off, show your face on camera, we welcome that as well. So we'll just give it a moment for folks to start populating those in the chat box as we begin to navigate through this content today. So looking forward to seeing our first virtual handshake in the chat box. Who's going to be our brave first? Kabir, welcome. Hello, pound it. Thanks, Kabir. All right, who's next? Robert, pound it. Thank you. Pam, thank you. High five. Freddie from Montreal, high five. Laura, oh, now they're coming fast and furious. We got some high fives. Happy salmon, high five. Pound it. Amazing. Great spread across the country. Thanks for joining us. High five, pound it. Another pound it. Happy salmon. Happy salmon makes my heart happy. Amazing, pound it. Super. Okay, thanks so much, folks. Keep those populating. Awesome. So we're going to keep moving through content today. What we're going to work on today, we're going to talk about why this work needs to be undertaken in recreation. And we're going to talk about what diversity, inclusion, and belonging are, and have you engaged in those conversations. Then we're going to talk about planning for inclusion and some pieces around leaders planning for DEI. So keep the introductions coming. Love seeing those flowing through, and love the choices and high fives I just saw. Happy salmon. Amazing. Okay, so why does this work need to be undertaken? And John set some nice context in terms of some of what was learned from the ReImagine RREC research and interviews and focus groups. And at the heart of this matter, it's really about people and how we make sure that we make space for each person to be a part of whatever it is they choose and want to be involved in. And when we look at the system of recreation, municipal recreation really initially was set up to support and improve the health and well-being of the white working class, both to make them more fit for labor and also to make them less dangerous to the wealthy class. So we started recreation really sort of, I'm going to say, segregating who it was for. And as we start to think about how we go forward, we need to reimagine that to think about how we make recreation for each person, and we're not adding on populations and creating these structures that continue to keep people out of recreation. How do we bring folks in? And I want to give credit to Dr. Lisa Tink and Dr. Danielle Pierce, who have been doing some really interesting work in navigating our understanding of recreation, where it's come from and where we need to go forward. So when we think about Canada and look at the Canadian population, we have a gender breakdown that's approximately 50-50. And when we look at that gender breakdown, we need to recognize that that's a very binary definition of gender. And we, as we evolve, are seeing that gender identities are shifting really rapidly, and we need to start to account for that. In our latest census, we started to ask questions about other gender identities. And so I think we have this opportunity as we go forward to really start to understand what the different gender identities are in Canada, and how we need to consider supporting those within our recreation systems. When we look at disability in Canada, about 22% of the Canadian population identifies as having a disability. That's from a 2017 stat, up from the 2012 stat of 14%. So we're seeing that we're having an increase in the number of folks with disabilities across Canada. We have an aging demographic, and people tend to age into disability. So it's not surprising that number's increasing. We also know that with mental health, we are starting to reduce the stigmas in people identifying when they have a mental health concern. And when we add a pandemic to that, which we know is going to have ongoing impacts in mental health and trauma, we will see that number continue to increase, and we need to be planning accordingly and training our staff and teams accordingly to really support a welcoming experience for all abilities. When we look at Black, Indigenous, and persons of color across Canada, about 4.9% of the Canadian population identifies as Indigenous, about 22.3% identify as persons of color from a range of backgrounds. And we know that those backgrounds are diverse, and really we've put in a few different, I'm going to call them categories of backgrounds, but each of those have very unique traits as well that need to be considered in how you're programming and thinking about those populations. And we know that with migration, which Canada was solely reliant on migration and immigration to Canada for our net population growth prior to COVID, and we anticipate that will come back as COVID becomes part of our normal lives. We will continue to see the number of persons of color in this country also increase. So when we think about how we're programming and what we're planning for, we need to really think about what the representation looks like in our programming and how we're creating really safe spaces. And Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment Foundation recently completed a study of 6,000 youth looking at their experience in sport and recreation. And in that study, they found that the number of Black youth that were experiencing racism was 1 in 3 in sport and physical activity. Indigenous youth, 1 in 4 were experiencing racism. So certainly thinking about sort of how we start to create safer spaces for folks. When we look at the impact on girls of the pandemic, sorry, my slide skipped ahead, pandemic impact on girls had some, more than 9 in 10 girls have decreased or halted their participation in sport during COVID. And we also saw that 1 in 4 girls are not committed to coming back to sport and physical activity. So some pretty significant gaps. We already knew going into the pandemic that girls were dropping out of sport and activities, that we were seeing lower and lower numbers, particularly as they head into their teen years. So another area that we really need to pay attention to, and grateful to Canadian Women in Sport that they're continuing to pay attention to this and give us some great data that we can work from to do better. When we look at persons with disability populations, Canadian Disability Participation Project has again done a great job in pulling together some research. And what we saw there is that throughout the pandemic, persons with disabilities lost a lot of the access to facilities and programs at a really disproportionate rate. We also saw that less children with disabilities are now meeting the physical activity guidelines as the pandemic progresses. So again, paying attention to how we support folks with disabilities to participate in programs and services. So I'm going to flip it to Nasreen, and we're going to start to get you engaged in our first activity to hear a little bit about your experiences.
Thank you, Andrea, and awesome. Always good to hear such great statistics. All of that information that you see in the slides is also available online. We're happy to share links. So if you can, open a browser and type www.menti.com and then enter the code 28718738. You will get a question. What is your why for DEI? En français, pourquoi la diversité, l'équité et l'inclusion? You may also use the, if you have a phone available, you may also use the QR code. I was like, the numbers inside. The QR code on the screen to open it. So we invite you to enter, you have up to 250 characters. We invite you to enter this into the answers, and Andrea and I will have a quick discussion with you after. So yeah, go forth, say good things. And I just want to be clear, diversity, equity, and inclusion is what DEI stands for.
MJ, if you can stop sharing so I can share up the results, that would be excellent. Okay, folks should be able to start to see those ones streaming in.
Joelle, oh, it just moved. May you please translate the one in the middle, la ville de Brossard?
La ville de Brossard est composée de 57 communautés ethniques.
But I understand that means there are 57.
Yes, sorry, translate, I didn't get. Yes, Brossard is made of 57 ethnic communities.
Wow. That's really, that would be really important to think about, right? Because your community really is exceptionally diverse, and many of our communities will continue to trend that way as population and migration increases. I think one person said, my why is because we want to feel welcomed and be part of our community. Absolutely. We want to develop and foster belonging in our world. And what better way to do it through recreation, through building our skills, through building connections. Joël, can you translate the one just at the bottom here? Nous sommes dans une communauté interculturelle.
Which one, sorry?
Nous sommes dans
Nous sommes dans une communauté interculturelle. We are in a... in a multicultural community, and then I don't know. It's
Oh,
good.
good.
Sorry. Maybe I can translate the one on the right. To give access to leisure to everybody without discrimination, to give them the same opportunities to participate for everybody.
Awesome. Thank you.
I'm in charge of a service for youth. Sorry, it's gone.
It's okay. We have a very diverse rural community, and I want everyone to feel welcome to be part of our facilities and programs and services. Awesome. Exactly. I think we think that rural communities may actually not be as diverse, but the opposite is quite often true. When there's so many different distinct communities that have been here for many, many years, including Indigenous communities. Awesome. All right, I think that we can move on to the next piece. Go back to the slides, please. Thank you, Joelle, for your translation. It was like being at the grocery store and something goes down the belt. You're like, no, I don't want to pay for that. Then you do anyway, it's fine. All right. So when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, it's a journey, it's a learning journey. Once you're, I'm doing a lot of learning myself around anti-racism, and what I knew last week is very different from what I know this week. So you do the best you can until you know better. And that is a quote from, and then when you know better, you do better. That's a quote from poet, author, mother, social change activist Maya Angelou. And she really promoted this idea of every time, like life is a learning experience. She, I think, was one of the most sage people that I will ever have learned from in my life, and has many, many, many impacts, but she's also made many mistakes and learned from them. And we want to create that environment in this learning space today, and also welcome you to have that bravery, have that curiosity, and when you know better, you do better. Diversity is a reality. Diversity is infinite, and it means all of us. So who's all of us? It's everyone on this earthly blue and green planet. So it's folks you haven't even met yet, folks you don't realize are even in your community, and people within your family systems, your friend systems. It's so many things. Each of us identifies as an Indigenous, a settler, or a new immigrant. We're in a time of constant migration, so we'll see more people, like Andrea said, as we see increases to relaxation of border controls and things like that, and we have more people coming in to fill those employment shortages that John mentioned at the beginning. Our shifting cultural norms and identities. So a study most recently out of the United States showed, I think, something like 50% of youth interviewed identified as gender non-binary, gender queer. So again, youth are changing the way they identify and will perhaps grow into adults who have different gender identities and expect to move through the world in a different way. We have rapidly changing demographics. The population that's growing the quickest in Canada is the Indigenous population. And we'll see that population grow in its share of demographics over time. And no two people are the same, but we have similarities. So what does diversity mean to you? So if you go back into the Mentimeter, we'll be able to, or if you want to open menti.com and enter this code again, we should be able to move on to the next question. bear with us. We will be sharing our Menti screen and changing the question to the next. So, oh, I love it. Man, I am a nerd. I love word clouds.
Différent mais pareil means different but the same.
Ah, yeah, absolutely. What a beautiful way to, well, it always sounds better in French, but it's a beautiful way to put it. Acceptance, fairness. What does réalité physique mean?
Physical realities. Merci.
Tolerance, acceptance is a big one. Seems like a lot of people are writing in inclusion, everyone, variety. Awesome. And just keeps getting bigger. Openness, beautiful. Ouverture d'esprit.
Open-mindedness.
Absolutely, that's super important. Yeah, we have so many different kinds of people, varieties of people. Everyone's included in that. Beautiful. Awesome. All right, let's get back into the presentation. Thanks for engaging with the Menti. It's super fun and it provides a really great live feedback for us. So diversity is a reality created by individuals and groups from a broad spectrum of demographic and philosophical differences. It is about understanding that each individual is unique and recognizing our individual differences. So I would think about diversity as the outward markers you can measure. And these can be along the dimensions of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, abilities, religious beliefs, political beliefs, or other ideologies. So you might collect this data already. You may collect where people live, what their gender is. But now, if you're thinking about diversity and wanting to get a bigger, wider picture of it, you might want to think about how do we collect more holistic data, more holistic demographic data, so we understand how folks from all different kinds of groups and identities are experiencing our services, how are playing, enjoying our world. So this is a video from author Chimamanda Ngozi. I just want to say she has been the theme of this is the danger of a single story, and she has also been challenged on her single story around trans identities as well. But I think it's a really powerful story about allowing folks to have diverse experiences and opening up our minds to them. I don't think we can hear it. I'm just mindful of time too, and wondering if we should probably just flip forward.
And so I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music. and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family.
I think Chimimanda's comments really speak to how we formulate a story about somebody and then assume that they're going to fulfill it. And I think that's just the best part. Like I was saying, I learned so much in a week about diversity, equity, inclusion on so many different dimensions that I ultimately have more questions and answers at the end of it. But the beautiful thing about getting to know our communities is that they will teach us about what they need. So they're very instructive about who they are, what their cultures are, and practices are along the lines of gender, along the lines of culture, religion, age. People will always tell us what their needs are. We have to create the welcoming environment in which they can declare that. There are three types of diversity. There's demographic. So like I mentioned, what you can measure on an intake form or on your census. Perfect example of demographic data collection. This year is really excited to see data collection around trans identity. That's something that we actually have very poor data collection on. When I worked in LGBTQI2S+ youth homelessness, that was one of the biggest issues, is that 25 to 75% of the youth homeless population is a member of the queer or trans community. But up until that point, there was actually no data to prove that, because you only had male or female on your intake forms, and you had no other ways to gather data on their context and their experiences in that system. Our life experiences. So who went through COVID? I'm just kidding. So I think everyone has a collective experience now together. Perhaps you moved, perhaps you had a change in your relationships, perhaps like me, you made the mistake and lovingly got a dog. I love my dog so much. We all also have cognitive diversity. So whether we hear, see, or need to hear and see, or other kinds of needs around taking in information. Some of us have an oral tradition in our community. Some of us are more written based and need to read something beforehand and review it and process it. All different kinds of diversity that affect how we participate and show up in our communities. So diversity, there are inward and outward aspects. So I'll go over this really quickly. The outward aspects are acquired and changing. I can learn Spanish using Duolingo, but I'm lazy and I don't right now. I can change my political beliefs for some reason. Not for some reason. I can add family, or have my family can reduce over time. And my internal dimensions are my race. So this is something I can't really change. I was born as an Arab person. My age, unfortunately, the clock keeps ticking. And the sex assigned at birth. So these are things that were given to me. When we talk about sex assigned at birth, it's like the medical classification of your sex, not necessarily the sex you identify with or gender you identify with. Your nationality, so where you were born, and so on. Our intersections, like we might think, who is really into one of the most controversial things in municipal planning is intersections. I'm just kidding. You know, when are they going to get that stoplight? Really important. But our intersections are layered and complex. They're more like this freeway, which I imagine is in Los Angeles, where there's so much complexity in each and every individual, both intergenerationally, so things we've inherited from our family, our current states and who we are, what our interests are, and our identities. I'm going to invite Andrea actually back into the conversation, and we're going to talk a little bit about intersectionality together. So intersectionality is a combination, and is your context. It's your context in a situation. So it's the power that you have, and the privileges, so the things that are unearned that you have in the society. This changes based on the makeup of the person. And so you put these building blocks together and you each get your own different set of powers and privileges, almost like a fingerprint. Andrea, I'd love to invite you to kind of chat about how you view power and privilege and the learning journey you've been on about this at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Nasreen. I think this is such a powerful opportunity for us to consider sort of how we show up in the world and how the world responds to us in some of the intersections that we bring to the table. And, you know, I know that I have a lot of unearned privilege because I'm white. You know, I have the resources I need to be able to have housing and food on the table. I've navigated through my life to a certain age and kind of built a network because of that. I have identified as being able-bodied and neurotypical that ascribes me privileges and opportunities that some of my colleagues who live with a disability are trying to navigate and work through. But on the other side, I also know that I've experienced different challenges because I'm female and identify as female, and I have certainly had lots of learnings along the way in terms of how I need to show up and some of the extra work that I need to do in order to get some of the privileges that I see my male colleagues just walking in the door and receiving.
Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, I think as we go on this learning journey, we realize how much power we have sometimes and how much the world is designed around our success or not. Whether it's because of our gender, our sexuality, our age, and our ability. When I think about the front door of the first recreation facility I can remember going into, I don't remember it being accessible for wheelchairs. I don't remember there being a lot of consideration for that. The kinds of activities that I like to engage in recreationally would require accommodation if I wasn't fully able-bodied. And I don't ever think about these things because I have able-bodied privilege. I could just go in, sign up for an adult swimming class and not really consider not have to ask or demand for my ability needs to be met. So I think about that when we think about recreation, because when we think about facilities planning specifically, this is going to be a much more important issue as we develop on our politics and policies around disability inclusion, as we develop and continue our politics and policies around gender inclusion. So having gender inclusive bathrooms, more accessible spaces and environments, building playgrounds that are accessible for wheelchairs and not just gravel on the ground or wood chips, making sure that there's the ability to have, for example, if you have a pool, maybe you have modesty apparel for Muslim people who are wanting to have a more covered bathing suit, for example, and still go swimming, all things like that. Inclusion is our choice. So I'd love to hear from you again on what does inclusion mean to you? I think at this point, I'd love to hear from a recreation perspective, what is making those steps to inclusion mean to you? So again, if you want to enter the menti.com, put in the code and or use the QR code here. We'd love to see your answers. And Andrea will share her screen to show, or someone will share their screen to show us the results. Okay, I see acceptance again. So diversity means acceptance, and then there's inclusion means acceptance. So what does that actually look like? How do we accept people? We say we accept you, and then how do we actually take steps to include you? So for everyone, Joelle, are there a few in there that you want to translate?
Accessibility for everyone. Welcoming everyone. Accept the differences. Equity.
Yeah, for sure. I think, yeah, accessibility for everyone. So on that spectrum of different tools you need to engage, different languages, and then having that access. So one of the things that we need to be careful of is to say, oh, well, somebody doesn't want to come. So I was learning about mental health in Punjabi community last week, and the advocate was, and I think they were from the Scarborough-Brampton area. He was saying, you know, we keep hearing that our community just has a bias against or doesn't really engage with mental health issues, that there's a taboo. But the fact is that people actually weren't even reaching out to that community directly in the language and cultural ways that they needed. So at one point, they actually set up a table at their Gurdwara, at their temple, and had a line out the door of people wanting to sign up for mental health services. So the question then becomes, how can we include by showing up for that community? As well, how can we include by intentionally planning for them to be there? If we can go back to the slides, that would be awesome. So inclusion is a dynamic state, like our Mentimeter, of operating in which diversity is leveraged to create a fair, healthy, and high-performing organization or community. Inclusion really comes in at the planning and development stage of your facilities and of your environments and your parks planning. An inclusive environment ensures equitable access to resources and opportunities for all. Certainly, you've heard probably through consultations or working with your community that different interest groups will have different perspectives on what's equal or equitable access. I don't know if anyone's had, I understand one of the most controversial issues in a municipality is whether or not a dog park can be put in place because they're loud, they're smelly. So certainly there's different perspectives on what equity and equality for access there is there. It also enables individuals and groups to feel safe, respected, engaged, motivated, and valued for who they are and for their contributions toward organizational and societal goals. So ultimately, your users, your residents, your clients will want to be able to know that they matter in your facility, in your park, in your community, and that they see themselves as a member of what you're creating. So they can choose to go swimming, so they can choose to hop on a trail on their bike, and they feel like this is their community, kind of seeing them and making sure that they have that opportunity too. When we talk about equity, reality, equality, equity, and justice, you've probably heard these terms like discussed in many ways and used interchangeably. So the reality is when we look at intersectionality, so the unearned privileges and the power that equity seeking groups, so folks who are not privileged in our current system, so a non-able-bodied, non-white, non-cisgendered people, is that there are specific barriers for their participation. So that in our current reality where we don't have any steps to inclusion, people don't participate equally. And this is why what we see now and what we're talking about at the beginning of this conversation around the pandemic. The pandemic disproportionately impacted women and gender diverse people. It also disproportionately impacted racialized people who are on the front lines of our healthcare system, of our trucking systems, of our food systems, making sure that we got what we needed and exposing themselves on a daily basis. Equality is when everyone gets the same support. So if we're thinking about walking up to a building, everyone walks up the same 3 sets of stairs, but it doesn't mean that everyone can climb those 3 sets of stairs. And it doesn't mean that it'll actually, that they can actually enter the front door because they might have a mobility challenge. They may not know where the building is at all because of language barriers. Equity is when you actually put the steps in place for people to equitably participate and enjoy something. So there are still barriers, but you are providing a ramp. You are providing clear directions on where to go and how to enter and exit the building. You're providing that and pressing a button to open the door. So providing those tools for people to enter and access the building is one way to look at it, or tools for people to engage in something so they can, and they're intentional and they're designed around them. Justice is having none of those barriers at all. So you wouldn't have those 3 steps at all. You wouldn't have any barriers. You'd basically just like have an open door, completely accessible, and everyone would be able to access the park or the community resource that you have. There's no need for accommodations because the system was designed around everyone participating to begin with. So in this situation, it's very easy for people to buy in, to participate because their needs are met, because the design of the facility, of the park, is around considers their participation. So belonging is our opportunity right now. So what does belonging mean to you in this moment? When do you feel like you most belong? And what is important to you when you're trying to create belonging in a parks and recreation environment? Go to your next slide and please enter one word. Joelle, can you translate it for them, please?
Yes. Team, friendship, to be proud.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, it's like you have pride in yourself, you have this community, you have those friends and those connections. I see acceptance and community are really, really big here. Again, acceptance seems to be the word for this workshop today, but it's at the end of the day, it's accepting people for who they are as they stand in front of you, not expecting them to be anything else. And having a community and what we're all striving for. I think our recreation facilities are the place of community. They're the place where you have weddings and birthdays. They're the place where you learn to skate for the first time, or swim, or gymnastics. They create that community feel, and they are used for so many different things, whether it's education, newcomers, mentoring, and certainly you want to create that belonging with them. Awesome. We can go back into the slides. That would be awesome. Thank you, MJ. I just want to have a round of applause for MJ because this is like a really big mission. There's so many different working parts on this. And I'm so appreciative of your patience today with us and our technology. So when we think about belonging, the experiences of it's the experience of personal involvement in a system or environment so that persons feel themselves to be an integral part of that system or environment. In other words, you're an integral part of an ecosystem. You're not just a blob floating out there on Earth, floating out in the middle of space. You don't have that total nihilistic view of the world, but you actually feel like you showing up matters and not showing up matters too. And that you also care about other people and their success, and they care about you. Forgive me. Oh, all right. So we'll hear from the illustrious Brene Brown. I just want to make sure that the audio is turned on for this one. second, and I will play the video. Oops.
Belonging. We're wired for love. We're hardwired for belonging. It's in our DNA. But let me tell you what belonging is. The opposite of belonging from the research is fitting in. That's the opposite of belonging. Fitting in is assessing and acclimating. Here's what I should say, be. Here's what I shouldn't say. Here's what I should avoid talking about. Here's what I should dress like, look like. That's fitting in. Belonging is belonging to yourself first. Speaking your truth, telling your story, and never betraying yourself for other people. True belonging doesn't require you to change who you are. It requires you to be who you are. And that's vulnerable.
So belonging requires you to just be who you are, which is such a hard thing. Andrea, tell us a little bit about your reactions to this and what it makes you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we started this journey around this company and thinking about what we wanted to influence, we was thinking about what are those cultures of belonging? How do we influence that? And how do we ensure that each person has the opportunity to belong? And in that journey, recognizing that that starts with you and how you feel about yourself and how you show up for yourself. And one of the conversations we began in May 2020 was Bridges of Belonging, where we asked leaders to share their journey of belonging and of not belonging and what that looked like and felt like for them, so that we could explore what we needed to think about and plan for to support cultures of belonging being what we all are striving for in this space. So we really look at sort of this journey of how do we think about diversity and support people where they're at and who they are, create these supportive environments through inclusion so that people can feel that sense of belonging.
Yeah, I love how you said it starts with you. And I think there's so much about this work that prevents us from wanting to have these conversations or start. But I wonder if there's something in you that you need to take care of first before you start these conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion. Maybe there's a sense of, I don't belong in this world anymore. Or I don't belong. I don't belong because the world's changing, but you do. You still do. Like the world was always changing. But we also want people to remember that having that groundedness will help you be much more brave and capable in this space as we move forward. So belonging is on a continuum. Andrea, do you want to kind of walk through this one?
Sure. Yeah. So when we look at this this visual, we're really looking at how we identify diversity and who people are, and ensuring that they have a space that they feel welcomed within, and then creating that safety for them to really show up there in all of their dimensions of diversity, celebrating, supporting those. So really kind of looking at that trajectory of diversity is who they are, thinking about how we create safety, which will really support them, and how we engage them, which is about inclusion. So what do we need to do around those spaces of equity to ensure that they have what they need, which will ultimately lead them to committing to being in a space and a place and move them towards that opportunity to feel like they belong there. So we see this as a continuum, and one that we need to continue to work on, especially when we think about how we started this conversation today and sort of who recreation was built for, and how we need to set up our systems and structures in the recreation world so that we create space for each person.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, just going to put, so I think we're going to talk a little bit about framing the diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. Everyone's going to be on a different journey. We're going to start with different resources and from a different place. Some folks mentioned, they've got over 50 different ethnicities in their community. There's also folks who might have less diversity in ethnicities, but may have diversity in age, or they may have more diversity in gender, for example. So start with understanding your community and where you can go from there. So key components of this when we're talking about recreation, diversity, equity, inclusion. So engaging and listening to the voices of equity seeking groups. We have to actually reconsider and reimagine some of our public consultation processes. So typically you might have a plan that goes out and you do an open house, yada, yada, yada. What you might actually find will work a lot better is if you have key informant interviews with specific group members and specific what we call caucusing or groups of a particular identity. So based on age, race, ethnicity, to have these discussions because you'll get to much more rich information as well. Diversifying how you collect that data and how you take the time to incorporate it. So actually taking more time to consider that planning and engagement process and not always doing what you've done, and considering as well a trauma-informed approach. So having clear accountability, accessibility to the process, lots of different ways to engage, considering timing and perhaps even payment. It's good best practice to provide honorariums. There's actually a consultation going on right now with the government of BC, doing a province-wide consultation on data collection and demographic data related to race, and they are paying participants an honorarium to participate because you're paying people who are sharing something about a lived experience that's actually caused them a lot of harm. And you are honoring their contribution through payment. So policy reviews through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. So whether it's hiring a firm or increasing your own knowledge or having a committee assembled that has a really strong understanding of diversity, equity, inclusion issues. So I'm talking about anti-racism, I'm talking about accessibility, I'm talking about LGBTQI2S+ inclusion. Get your superstars around the room and have a review of what you have. Sometimes in your policies, you actually have tools that you didn't even know you had before, or you weren't using to the best and highest good. So equipping your teams with tools to intervene and address bullying, harassment, racism, and prejudice. Many of your teams will be frontline. They've probably seen this stuff already and have confidence in dealing, hopefully addressing the public and dealing with conflict related to the public. But if there's allyship training that they might want to take, so that's something we offer as a micro-learning, a 1-hour micro-learning. We could talk about allyship and how we support people and intervene. Or if it's taking conflict resolution courses and things like that to help people understand how to have conflicts even interpersonally amongst your team. Employing recreation as a tool for equity, so ensuring that recreation can be that equalizer. So there's lots of different kinds of programs in our communities. I can think of Mandem, which is a male Black-led cycling club in Toronto. How can you partner with a group like that that's grassroots and provide them maybe facilities or storage for their program and as a partnership and amplify them. So creating that equity. Or can you consult with those equity seeking groups you're trying to increase your participation from and design a program around their needs, things like that. Ensure that you have DEI informed facilities planning. So certainly many of you have gone through a recreation master planning process or something thereabouts. How was diversity, equity, and inclusion incorporated? Did you have a specific lens or consultant who had the expertise in this? Obviously, I work in this full time, so I have a very specific expectation of what I would look for in a DEI consultant to do this. It's a little bit different than municipal planning, which is incredibly important in this, but you're also adding in that layer of what's that human experience in this work, and that requires a whole different set of thinking. I would akin it to having like an accounting degree versus having a planning degree. So it's just very different modes of thinking, but that can very much be used in complement. We do this every day with our government, nonprofit, and private sector partners. We find lots of ways to offer that complement of learning to enhance their long-term planning. So in our breakout rooms, we have about 10 minutes for this. The illustrious MJ has put us into a pre-assigned group. So I would love for you to have a conversation on what can you do to achieve equity in recreation. So how can you intentionally plan to have those resources available for people in your recreation systems? And you'll be put into those groups and you have about 10 minutes. So MJ will open up the rooms, make sure you have a scribe, and we will randomly, if you're lucky, pick a few of the groups to share back with the broader group here.
And just a note I put in the chat, you're going to use Menti to track out on your conversation. And so if one or two people can take a few notes that we can then share back to this entire group after the webinar, that would be great. Thanks so much.
Oh. Live long and prosper, everybody. Okay, so how's it going? All right, I think rolling back in here. Some people are leaving. Some people have had enough. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I hope you're all having a really good time. So I think group one, which Joelle was part of, I would love to hear from your group what you felt what the barriers are to achieving equity in recreation. I'll come back to you. I'll come back to you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'm picking at random. So I do this because I believe in you. Group 10, do you know who was part of group 10 or breakout room 10?
Nazreen, I wasn't part of group 10, but I'll share what my group came up with. So skill level, fee were both seen as barriers, but maybe the most important or the most prevalent was transportation to and from facilities in both a rural and an urban context. So those are, I mean, I know those are on the ground, really practical examples, but that's what we came up with in our group.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you can't get somewhere, how are you going to enjoy it, sort of thing? And yeah, transportation planning in rural areas is very challenging, and yeah, and fees and things like that. Again, and then skill level as well. If you don't feel like you can do something, you may not want to opt into doing it. Group 13 wants to go. Thank you, Janet.
Hi, happy to go. I had a nice chat with Marie in Ontario, and I'm in North Vancouver in BC here. So we had a great chat. It was really neat to have the perspective of sort of urban. I'm in an urban center, and Marie's in more of a rural center. So we definitely talked about transportation to facilities and the challenges that they have with trying to partner with other organizations to have volunteer drivers to bring people to centers. We also talked about income and financial barriers that people have to participating. Both of our municipalities provide some financial assistance, but there's always gaps for people who you know, need greater support than what the programs provide. And we talked about facility accessibility to the facilities, new construction, and the opportunity to ensure that we have facilities that people with mobility challenges have greater access to the buildings and easier access. So that was it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think in our group, we talked about, I don't name names, but we talked about having facilities that the community thought was designed in an accessible manner, but upon doing a further audit, they found it was not. And so it's actually ensuring that you also have sometimes it's really challenging to figure out where do you start, right? Where do you start with the right advisors on this stuff and the right information? And also different groups will have different opinions of what is or is not accessible, gender inclusive, and so on as well. So being flexible and responsive is important. Joelle, would you feel comfortable sharing at this point?
Yes. We spoke about the difference between equality and equity. Sometimes we want to do the same for everybody, but it's best to listen to their needs, to be sure that everybody can participate.
Yeah, exactly. I think that developing, like we're talking about, developing strong public engagement methods and tracking and experiences and welcoming environments will help you understand what those needs are in a responsive way. I think group 8, my favorite number, wanted to share as well. So I'd love to hear from you.
So I was with Paige and Joseph, and there were a few barriers, but most of it was more around organizational, like kind of bigger picture organizational things. So, I mean, one, definitely the geographical context, like rural piece that was mentioned, but you know, one organization, the rec department, is quite new, only a few years old. So, you know, just having a new developing department, and then barriers around like lack of definition and really understanding of what equity and diversity is, you know, at different levels, including at the leadership level, which can, you know, hamper calls for training or support for training, you know, not necessarily having a comprehensive plan around diversity, equity, inclusion, and then also budget around that. So some of the things we talked about in terms of options to address this, you know, it's incremental, but, you know, having a champion and having people talk about diversity, promoting diversity and inclusion, creating an environment where it's okay for us to learn and to make mistakes, because you know, it is a topic that, you know, people don't want to offend anyone. I think that's something in recreation. We don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. We're thinking about like all the good stuff, but you know, just making it okay for us to be in a learning phase and really like sharing information about things like free webinars like this if we don't have the resources. So those were some of the things that we talked about for addressing some of those bigger things, but in smaller ways.
Awesome. I think one of the things I really picked up on was that tricky balance between appealing to your senior leaders and perhaps your advisory councils if you have a recreation board or recreation committee that you have to report to, and also meeting the immediate needs of the people participating and wanting to take advantage of your recreation resources. So I thought that was, really, really tricky, because I think leaders want to say, okay, well, give me a solution right now. Give me a diversity policy. And you're like, wait, I need to consult. We need to do research. We need to understand our current state. We need to audit, right? So these things, like I mentioned, are their own, I don't want to scare you, but they are their own animal. They require intention, time, resources, and they can't always just be done on a one-off basis, because you won't get the results that you want. And you will end up making more mistakes than you would desire. But we do think like this is a long-term process. Diversity, equity, inclusion is for the long term and is for all of us ultimately, because if you are free, I'm free. If you're doing well, I'm doing well. If we're all doing well, our communities are doing better and best. If I can go back into the slides, please, that would be awesome. I'll do one last thing and then we'll have wrap up and questions. So the key things to consider when you're planning for DEI, this is from the Maple Leaf Sports Foundation, and they did a really amazing report on recreation needs for youth. Andrea actually used some of the data at the beginning of the presentation. I highly recommend reading the report. Design your recreation about why youth are playing. Are they playing for mental health reasons, to get away from their families? Is this the place that they go to have peace and quiet? Incorporate the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. So there's specific recreation recommendations in the calls to action. They are, and they can be practically applied. I really want to emphasize that, because people might think that the calls to action are just ideal, but they can be practically applied in your day-to-day. Understand access, equity, and engagement issues. Create a welcoming environment. Review recruitment and hiring practices to increase representation. This may already be happening in your local community, in your municipality, in your organization. Can you be a louder voice about this if it's something that's also out of your control but impacted by your organization? Maintain health and safety protocols, of course, really important, that you can do this and balance, the day-to-day operations. Be a good neighbor in your community. So like I mentioned, the Mandem Black-led cycling group, can you be a good neighbor? Can you provide supports to that group and build relationships? Can you reach out? Can you be intentional that way? Can you conduct needs assessments to optimize facility allocations? So again, if you're going through a master planning process, include an intentional part of your master planning process that is diversity, equity, inclusion of access to resource analysis, budgeting, and so on. And offer inclusive and adaptive opportunities. Are there new sports that maybe you can be the fertile ground? I think one of the participants in my group said it's, if you offer a new program, maybe it's 5 participants at first, but it's 5 participants you didn't have before. And so trying new things, being innovative, and understanding that this is a place of learning and growth, and offering those adapted opportunities. So there are a range of opportunities for people of all ability levels to participate. So some key questions to think about: what resonated with you today? What's worrying you or even scaring you? What are you afraid of? Give that monster a name and put it to bed. What did you feel unsure about? What did you feel confident in? And what did you need more information about? We're open to questions for about I think 5 to 7 minutes now. So thank you. And you can pop your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand if you just want to say them in English or French.
We would love to hear from you. So if there's something that's also just resonating with you that you want to throw in the chat or come off mute to share with us, we're really open to that as well. There's been lots of content today and lots of great discussions in those chat rooms. So feel free to share something. Hello, David Arsenault.
Hi there. First of all, thank you very, very much for organizing this. I feel included and part of a community and learning a lot. So how do we continue to take part in this and stay connected? Because I feel there's great value, and I hope that you're going to continue to do this and allow us to participate.
Yeah, so thanks for that question, David. And a first piece, I would say, I know that Cpra had promoted at the beginning the conversation on the bench. So I think that I'll promote that on their behalf, that's a place where the conversation can continue. And then we're going to be part of the ReImagining RREC webinar series as that continues. So continuing to bring the inclusion content in that next few series. So look forward to continuing the conversation that way. And then also welcome you to reach out to us on our email or our social media channels if you've got questions or are looking for support. So info@inclusionincorporated.com is probably the easiest way to email us. And Nazreen just put our website on the chat. And we also send out a monthly newsletter that's full of great tips and advice. So self-promotion plug there, but yeah, hopefully those are helpful for you.
And Andrea, thank you. I just wanted to add, yeah, David, thank you for your comment and for your question. And as Andrea mentioned, yes, definitely we want to keep this conversation going through our discussion group on the bench. And that doesn't have to be started by us at Cpra. If you would like to start the conversation, anybody here, that would be amazing. We are actually making some changes to the bench, so it will be even easier to see some of the content coming in and out. So we really welcome your thoughts and comments. Cpra has also made a commitment to equity, diversity, inclusion, and access. And that it will be reflected as we start to re-examine the framework for recreation in Canada over the next several years, not only in its new iteration beginning in 2025, but also how we enact this in the framework as it exists now. There is a goal in the framework that looks at equity and inclusion and access. And we want to really use the time remaining on that particular, in this framework edition, to figure out the best way that we can do that for Cpra internally, and then to support all of you in the sector as well. So more to come from us as well.
Stephen Allen?
Yeah, nobody else is asking questions, so I'll ask one. So thank you for the great webinar today. Social justice, the term, we've had conversations at our board table with my organization, and sometimes social justice can be an intimidating term or intimidating movement. I even think of like the Black Lives Matter. Some of the board members felt a little challenged by it, seeing it as a negative space. So any thoughts on how we can sell social justice?
I'll take this one, Andrea. I think I've been reading this book called The Conversation by Dr. Livingston, and I've been talking about it nonstop. I highly recommend reading that book because there's some really good pieces in there about how to have this conversation. And your curiosity on how to sell social justice. I think it depends on the position of the person. If they share your values, like if your board, you're joining a board to hopefully do good for yourself and the community, you need to appeal to those values. And I also think we need to be careful. Well, you mentioned Black Lives Matter, and I'll use it as an example. I think there's a really big misunderstanding around branding and language with Black Lives Matter, because there's a bias in the justice system in the US that Black lives do not matter as much. And so when they go missing, when they're murdered by police, they're not considered worthy of investigation or consideration or news media. And that's where it comes from, is bringing to the forefront that we have this bias in our minds around who matters and who doesn't. And I think many of these movements, social justice movements, from a political science perspective, take like 30, 40 more years, right? I'll use childcare actually as another example. Childcare advocacy has been happening for 90 years or more. Like this kind of quality, like $10 a day childcare advocacy that we see has been a social justice issue for many, many years. And now we see the fruits of that labor. And so it's always continuing to have the conversation, understanding your power, your privilege, the knowledge that you have. And then also inviting in those communities. So what are you afraid of not inviting into in that conversation? We always think about on our biases that who are we listening to and not listening to, sorry. And who in the room needs to be there to have that conversation. And so as a board, can you go out and listen to a free webinar on racial justice together, or read a book or something like that, just to get the conversation going, but never giving up on the importance of creating more equitable space for everyone, because that's the problem. That's also where you find, in which you find the solution. So bravery, focus, getting good data and getting good information. So I'll put the book in the chat as well for you.
Thanks, Nasreen. We have a question in the chat from Mike Roma about another intimidating term is ethical space. Are you aware of this concept, and can you comment on it? So Nasreen, I don't know if you want to lead with that. And I know we also need to turn it back to Mike to wrap us up shortly. So
Well, Mike, okay, so every space, we've probably heard safer spaces or safe space. Every space perhaps should have a list of agreements on how to engage. So your terms of engagement, you might call that ground rules, you might call that principles. I think it's good to have that robust conversation. If I think about this from a trauma-informed lens, so there's a whole school of thinking around policy design from a trauma-informed lens, you really want to create spaces where you know who's using the information, what for, why, and there's a dialogue and accountability. It's unethical, in my view, to go into a community, so a racialized community, asking for a bunch of information, like that's happened many, many times with Indigenous communities, not pay them for it, and then do nothing about it, because you've just gone and re-traumatized them. Just to get to extol some of what we call, just extol their lived experience, their trauma for no reason. So think about that intentionally, and that all happens before you get into the space. So I'll leave it there and pass it back to you, Mike.
Thanks. Very good. Thanks, Nazreen and Andrea and John and others. Thanks to Michelle and Park for partnering with us to provide this. I think, like I said in my opening, even though I wasn't on camera, this is an issue that's faced the sector for a long time, and it's just been intensified over the last couple of years. And it's great to see our members from across Canada participating in these kind of webinars, talking about a topic like this or the other ones that we'll tackle or that we have tackled with the ReImagine RREC work and other work that Cpra does. And we really appreciate the participation and the sharing, because when you're in the room, when you're interacting with somebody from across Canada, and next to you is somebody from your own local community, it really adds to the dynamic nature of learning, I guess. And we're really proud to be able to do that. And David, to your comment about having more connection, we're on it. We're trying to do more and more every day at Cpra to bring people together. So on behalf of the board, again, thanks to our speakers, and thanks to all of you for participating. And I'm just going to hand it over to Krista to wrap things up for us. Great. Thank you, Mike. Yes, heartfelt thanks to Andrea and Nasreen and John as well for a great workshop today. This is something Cpra is trying to do. It's a bit new. We've done webinars for quite some time, and these are more expanded workshops that go on for, as you can tell, a little bit longer. And this one 2 hours, and our next one, which I'll talk about in a second, is an hour and a half, so that we have an opportunity to delve into a topic a little bit more and make them a little bit more interactive. So we appreciate your time that you've spent so much with us today. We do have a feedback survey that we would love for you to complete for us, again, to see if this format works for you and so on. It will come up right away when you leave Zoom, but you'll also receive a link to it in both English and French about 15 minutes after 2 o'clock Eastern today, when we end our workshop. So if you don't mind taking a few minutes, it should not take very long. Also, I just wanted to remind you that Andrea and Nasreen had provided each and every one of you with a workbook highlighting today's topics. It's in both English and French again. And so we'll, if you haven't received it for some reason, just get back to us and let us know. We'll make sure that you get it. And again, a final, in case you needed one more reminder about the bench, that the tools will be there, and all of our other workshops also are featured there. I'll let Joelle also comment in French, and then we'll tell you about the next workshop. Over to you, Joelle.
Merci, Krista. Merci, Andrea. Merci, Nasreen. Merci à tous pour votre participation. Il y a un sondage d'évaluation que nous aimerions que vous complétez. Vous allez recevoir le lien en quittant et aussi par courriel. L'enregistrement du webinaire sera placé sur le banc. Donc, je vous rappelle l'adresse lebanc@cpl.ca, et vous recevrez le lien par courriel également. Le prochain webinaire aura lieu le 2 décembre, donc le prochain webinaire du projet RÉCRÉvolution, le 2 décembre de midi à 13h30 heure de l'Est. Il portera sur le loisir comme élément essentiel à la vie communautaire et au bien-être. Merci à tous et bonne fin de journée. Christa, à toi la parole.
Thank you. So as Joelle just said in French, our next workshop is coming up December 2nd from 12 to 1:30, and that's 9 to 10:30 Pacific time, 1 to 2:30 Atlantic time. We'll be looking at recreation as essential in community life and well-being, and focused on three main topics, many topics, but especially recreation as a tool for citizen building and well-being. What do elected officials, finance officials, and planners need to support your cause, and human resources, which is a huge issue in our sector right now in terms of recruitment and management and building back better for human resource and other recovery. So that's coming up. We will also have 2 more workshops in the new year, and those dates and topics will be released very soon. So encourage you to check our website at cpra.ca, and of course, the bench. So with that, thank you so much again for your participation today, and to our speakers. Merci. Have a great day. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.